avant-gardism and modernism are tied, meaning modernism is actually a crisis of the bourgeois subject. It's a crisis of these bourgeois art forms. And I think that Lukács says the author of entertainment literature never encounters this problem. Meaning, you could, of course, write novels as if there isn't a crisis of the bourgeois subject, and that would be your kind of popular fiction. That would be your Stephen King or James Patterson or whatever, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Or Tom Clancy or whatever, although it's still there too. In other words, it's actually still there. It's not like these people are innocent of modernism. They're not, right? So they're just kitsch modernism.
Welcome to the Cutronezone again. With me today, as always, is the chief pedagogue, track coach, contrarian, resident genius, Chris Cutrone.
Last Marxist.
And the Last Marxist.
Don't forget that.
The Last Marxist, Chris Cutrone. I'm Douglas Lane, author of Bash Revolution and a variety of other things. I am the chief expansive realist at Sublation Media. A new genre I'm trying to develop. So, Chris, and actually we might discuss it a bit in the second half, in the Patreon half, but this week we're discussing a piece that will be out today in Sublation Magazine called Fear Itself. And this is your attempt to kind of provoke and direct the conversation around Trump's tariffs. And you intended to direct the conversation, provoke the conversation from the pages of Compact magazine.
Yes, it was solicited by them. Mm-hmm.
Yes, this was solicited for publication in Compact, but for whatever reason, they didn't want this piece. And so now, I guess we're second choice, but we will be glad at Sublation to publish the piece.
Right. It maybe was provoking them too much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I read this, I mean, I understand the point of your piece, but I have patrons and YouTube commenters and people on Twitter who give voice to what is, I think, not just like left opinion, but actually respectable opinion across the gamut, from far left to center right.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that's not MAGA. Mm-hmm. The opinion is that the tariffs are a debacle, a mistake, that it demonstrates Trump's incompetence, his stupidity, his lack of seriousness, that they are only going to be a disaster, and that only the most brainwashed amongst us would ever support Trump's attempt to impose tariffs on the world this way. But you take a counter view. Yeah,
I take a different view. I mean, I actually wanted to take the opportunity this week also with you, Doug, to talk about how I talk about things here and also how I write about things. You know, what my goals actually are, the intervention that I'm trying to make. So I'm trying to really insist that people think about things.
Yeah.
And I do think that what we're faced with now with the tariffs is the entire purpose of Trump's presidency ever. Meaning, this is the only reason he wanted to be president. So this is the thing. This is why he ran in 2016. It's the only reason why he's ever considered getting into politics, starting in the late 1980s. It's why he supported Ross Perot in 1992 to stop NAFTA. This is the whole deal. Like, this is the only thing he cares about. Now, he was elected by the Republican Party to do other things, close the border, etc. Stop men from playing in women's sports, whatever. Just the whatever menu of things that. But does he care about those things? Not so much. He cares about this. And so this is the thing, and this is the thing that is going to be most consequential. But in terms of the debacle and the disaster, in many respects, the debacle and the disaster has already happened. Meaning, COVID already disrupted world trade and the global economy. And the global recession was already a challenge with respect to what I've been banging the drum about for 10 years, post-neoliberalism. Meaning the crisis of neoliberalism and the emergence of post-neoliberalism, which I know that people reject this idea. They reject the very,
I don't understand why. I mean, because it was actually common coin on the far left as far back as 2007 or 2008. Almost everyone was understanding that there would have to be something other than the neoliberal order.
Yes, that something new is coming. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I also would just point out that, Trump as a fascist, right? So you've had conversations with Studebaker, and Studebaker would say that in many respects, neoliberalism is just the fulfillment of the post-World War II order. In other words, that neoliberalism starts with Bretton Woods, we might say. And maybe it's synonymous, I guess, in this view with U.S. hegemony. Now, there is a point to that, even though I would disagree. I would disagree on a number of levels. I would say that American hegemony started in World War I. The U.S. was already the largest global economy before World War I. And World War I was when the European powers bankrupted themselves to the United States. And the real issue is that the U.S. didn't step up to really politically take over, and only did that after World War II. It didn't ratify the League of Nations. It didn't assume the role that Woodrow Wilson wanted. But it still tried to manage the global economy by lending money to Germany so that Germany could pay the war reparations, so that France and Britain could pay back the U.S. for the war debt. And that all fell apart with the stock market crash, with the Great Depression. And the U.S. also tried to help the Soviet Union in the 1920s as well. There was a great deal of American investment in the Soviet Union, and that dried up. And they also bought things from the Soviet Union. So all of that broke up with the Great Depression. Now, what we've had, why I would still hold to the idea of like Fordism and post-Fordism, is that there was a crisis in the 1970s. There's a sort of inarguable crisis. One thing that's interesting, I was watching a documentary on Bretton Woods and Nixon breaking Bretton Woods, and how everyone at the time said this is going to cause another Great Depression. Maybe it did. Maybe it did. Right, so that's the thing. It's not remembered that way. What's remembered is the oil shock and whatnot. But maybe actually it was Nixon going off the gold standard. And maybe it did actually produce another Great Depression that we kind of muddled through, and that, Reagan and Thatcher come out of that. And other things come out of that. I've studied a lot of history related to this, like the fall of the Shah of Iran, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. How that came out of the 70s crisis. The third world, the developmental state, the post-colonial world, all went into crisis in the 70s. It was a very brutal time. And there were many things that happened at the end of the 1970s and in the early 1980s. The Shah famously said, we're going to grow at this rate forever in the 70s, and we're going to overtake France. And of course they didn't. And that produced the Islamic Revolution. So there definitely was a crisis in the 70s that one could also argue brought down the Soviet Union, ultimately. Because that's when... Go ahead.
I just want to say, just to step back to Nixon taking us off the gold standard, it is not as though, if that did cause a major global economic crisis, whether it's a depression or a long recession or whatever you want to call it, if it did do that, well, it's not as though the alternative was simply to stay the course and have prosperity.
That's right.
The reason he did that was because the system as it was going was leading towards a global crisis.
Anyway, that's right.
Right.
That's right. And that's what we're dealing with now, right? So what we're dealing with now is actually Trump trying to get out ahead of something. And it's something that's been kind of, simmering since COVID. And, the question is whether the COVID stimulus was overdone, right? So back in the day, the question was whether the Obama stimulus with the Great Recession was underdone. And then the question is, was the COVID crisis overdone?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at the TARP, and the bailouts of Obama, much, much less. It was less than $1 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this is many trillions of dollars poured into the U.S. economy to prop up after COVID, which, by the way, propping up the U.S. economy is propping up the world economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that this has produced a global crisis. Now, you were talking
I want to interject one thought.
Yeah.
Just I heard recently on America This Week that in fact the amount of money spent around TARP was much more than was officially on the books or what we were told at the time, that it was.
Oh, there were ramified. There were other dimensions to it. Yes.
Yeah, but nonetheless, it is the case that the question now is, did we overspend to correct the COVID crisis? And the so I'll let you continue. I did want to. Look, I'll say this, and which is
all of this is in contention, by the way.
Yeah.
So again, we're going to express some opinions here, but the goal of doing so is not to say agree with our opinions, but consider, think,
right,
open the mental space to think, allow yourself to think, to reconsider, to reframe things. Let's break out of the talking points, because as we know, the Democrats just want to win the midterms and they want to win the presidential election in 2028. So they have a ready-made narrative, which is that everything that Trump does is a disaster.
Right.
It's a debacle, it's going to fail, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. Now, we're not here to say it's going to succeed or fail. We're here to say, don't buy the party line of the Democrats. Now, interestingly,
there's another line that we need to correct, I think.
Okay.
It's not the Democrats' line. It's not the Republicans' line. It's the Marxist line.
You mean the Fabio Vighi line?
Yeah, it's Fabio Vighi is one version of it. Andrew Kleinman is another. David Harvey's is another.
Sure, yeah.
There's this Marxist understanding of 2008, right? Which the way I think of it most of the time is I remember a lecture that Kleinman gave where he was talking about the inevitability of economic crisis under capitalism, and that the depth of the crisis could only be corrected through a massive devaluation and the destruction of capital. Whether that didn't necessarily mean through war or physical destruction, but it did mean some sort of massive devaluation of capital. And the implication was at the time that massive devaluation would come along with atrocities. And you just sort of gesture
often does, right?
Just sort of gesture at World War II, the Holocaust, nuclear bombs going off, just massive human destruction. And the other
generation came up in the shadow of World War II.
Right.
It came up in the shadow of Vietnam, which is different.
Well, yeah, but I grew up in the shadow of NORAD. Right.
Right. That's true too. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So anyhow, so that's my imagination. And the idea was that the only alternative to this massive destruction, this cataclysm that the capitalists would produce if left to their own devices, was socialism. Right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Isn't it a very? I mean, look, I don't want to be that Marxist. So I don't want to be the Marxist who predicts 10 out of the last 5 downturns and 0 of the last 10 upturns. Right. Nor do I want to be the Marxist who says nothing that they try will ever work. Right? Because we're like hundreds of years into capitalism now. We celebrated the bicentennial of Marx's birth a few years back. And I would just say that Marx's Das Kapital, all 3 volumes, which are kosher, we can trust. We can trust Engels and Kautsky. We know what Marx wrote. Marx leaves all sorts of options open for how capitalism can navigate its crises.
Right. And what I would say is that the failure of the old Marxists that I was sort of brought into and trained by to some degree is this idea that the only alternative to the bloodletting was socialism. But on the
bloodletting, like the
right on the
fentanyl
flip
crisis,
side of it,
you know?
on the flip side of it, it's actually true that the only alternative to the bloodletting is socialism. But what does that mean? How do we imagine that? What?
Right.
So I don't. Just at the outset here, I want to point out that whatever Trump is going to do to try to fix things will involve monstrous consequences somewhere.
Sacrifice.
And sacrifice. And he's saying so directly. But what we should also take into account is we've been here before.
Yep.
And some sort of passable order often emerges from...
Always emerges.
Yeah, always. Well, right. It often...
Always. Meaning
I would just say there might be a period of time, and has been a period of time, where nothing quite emerged and things stumbled along.
70s.
Or from 2008 to now.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, something has kind of emerged partially.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, Trump obviously was intending to serve 2 terms sequentially.
Mm-hmm.
And, COVID messed things up for him. However, it also now gives him an opportunity. So a lot of things that were in the background for the millennial left, like Naomi Klein, shock doctrine, disaster capitalism, of course, at a certain level, that's true. Meaning every disaster is an opportunity. Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief of staff and former mayor of my town, Chicago, never let a good crisis go to waste as an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Trump is doing that. I mean, the stakes are very high. Like, let's not kid ourselves. The reason that I titled my article Fear Itself is because there's a lot to fear. I think we have more to fear about the long-term economic consequences than we do of, like, World War III. For now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that, obviously the pressure Trump's putting on China is enormous. Enormous.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's really shaking them.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously he doesn't want to destroy China. That's not the point.
And China was already shaking.
Yeah, it was already due
to its internal problems. Which are not uniquely Chinese problems either.
They're not uniquely Chinese problems. Obviously, Europe has problems. I mean, people were talking about the end of the German model.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot going on. I mean, I think that Yanis Varoufakis is good to pay attention to, even though he can be tendentious, and he does want to see a European-China alliance against the United States. Good luck with that. I addressed that in my article. That's really not going to happen, and Trump's going to use Russia to prevent that anyway, but it's just not going to happen. I would say that, the crisis of the Eurozone, that was most dramatically demonstrated with the Greek sovereign debt crisis.
Right.
It continues, right? So the AfD now became, like, second largest vote getter in the last election, but now is being termed like a terrorist organization by the German state, basically, right? Which is remarkable. But notice that the Democrats want to do that with Trump.
Yeah.
Right. So it's coming to a point, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Where, like, the economic powerhouse of Europe has to declare a new political party verboten. And in the United States, the only possible salvation of the Republican Party also has to be cast as domestic terrorism. Remember what Biden said?
Yeah.
Greatest national security threat to the United States is MAGA.
Yeah, but what I don't understand, and this gets to your urge for people to get to try to think about the situation, is that it is not as though the continuation of the old establishment and the neoliberal order is possible or wasn't itself a massive threat to law and order and humanity and all of it, right? And
there's a lot to say about that. I mean,
a lot very authoritarian.
Oh, surely there's that.
Regimes.
I mean, there's all sorts of things. I mean, the thing that you and I used to butt heads over a couple of years ago was just how much of a threat the Ukraine war was with respect to World War III or nuclear Armageddon, and I was like, yeah, no. However, what's clear is that if Kamala Harris had been elected, the U.S. was just going to sleepwalk into whatever disaster and be like, oh, it's so horrible. Look at how bad Hamas is. Look at how bad Vladimir Putin is. Look at how bad Xi is. Oh, why are they doing these things? Right? So now, that's not to say that those people are not culpable and responsible for their own actions. They are. But the overall situation and the creating of a dangerous circumstance in which people can make catastrophic mistakes. Like, Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a mistake. He didn't intend it to be a multi-year grinding trench war. He meant it to be a few weeks and knock out the Ukrainian government and put in a client state regime that, he that's what he wanted to do. And, so, World War I was like that. It was meant to be a quick war, not the worst catastrophe of all time up to that point.
Right.
So, mistakes can happen and circumstances can be created that are more likely to lead to such mistakes. And
I just want everyone to note that Chris just told me that maybe I was more correct than he thought when I was worried about this before.
I just thought psychologically, again, it's important for us to not be spellbound by the terror. I mean, look, New York City ran advertisements, public service announcements, what to do if New York is nuked. How do you hide in your building? What do? You shower immediately after being exposed to radioactive debris. And I'm like, do you really think the water is going to be running? Why did they do that? Was that saber rattling against Russia? Probably, but it's very subtle, isn't it? I mean, I can just imagine that it's just bureaucrats saying, "Oh, we might have to fight for World War III,"
what I wanted to do, and this is maybe misguided, was to say, look, all of this is unacceptable.
Right.
This is deserving of a political response from below. But obviously we didn't have the capacity. We didn't have the capacity to do it.
Right. Such that we could. I mean, look, obviously Trump was elected to avoid World War III with Russia.
Yeah.
Let's just be very clear about that. Now, that doesn't mean it won't still lead there, because I think that Trump did do what I talked about him doing with Netanyahu in my Mara Gaza article for Compact, which is that he kind of apparently gave Netanyahu everything so that he couldn't ask for anything else. He tried to do that with Putin, and Putin's still balking. So then Trump might be like, you know what? Maybe we do need to ratchet up the military pressure on.
Right.
I just think that for us, in terms of, I mean, look, even if there is World War III, there will be capitalism afterwards. Therefore, the struggle for socialism will continue, right? In the irradiated, hellscape. Because after all, we're still living in an irradiated hellscape.
What I wonder about, you said Jan Varoufakis wants to build an alliance between Europe and China against the United States. Why? Why would he want that? And also, especially considering, how would that be possible, considering Europe is dead set and apparently in overturning Putin and being in conflict with Russia,
right?
And China and Russia are somewhat more aligned now than they were before. So, how is Europe going to align with China? And what is he imagining, that Russia and the United States are going to be allied? Or
possibly?
I don't
know. There's a lot of, psychologically, there are many layers, and we all have our fantasies. We all go to sleep each night and dream, and who knows what our unconscious mind is processing and how we're putting things together. And we are being fed a kind of image of the world. And, there might be this kind of reactionary fascist world, Trump and Putin, versus progressive capitalist world, Europe and China. That might be a plausible thing in people's minds.
Where would you rather live? Russia or China, Chris?
Damn. Shit. Oh, neither.
Right. Well, I
Um,
imagine though, it might be a bit easier to be me
in
in
China?
Russia.
In
No.
Russia? I don't know. I
Yeah,
mean, as a
because
gay, I'd have a hard time in both
well,
places.
yeah, I know, but
You
as a
know?
straight
Oh yeah, you
dissident,
do well in Russia.
right?
You have babes hanging off your arms.
Yeah, but
Right?
I might get locked up. I might get locked up, but I might be able to avoid it. There's enough of a criminal class still in Russia, I
Yeah, there's a
figure.
criminal class in China too. It's called the Communist Party.
Well, that's not the same thing. They're in charge. I'm
Right,
talking about a countervailing
right.
criminal.
Countervailing. I don't know if Russia's more liberal than China. I really don't know because China has some liberalism too. Right. So, like, obviously, people learn how to live under regimes, and that's true in the United States too. It's not like we're going to say, "Oh, the United States is just some like completely open walk in the park." It depends on where you live, and it depends on what your circumstances are. However, yes. So, but I'm just thinking, like Yanis Varoufakis, right?
Mhm.
How does he see the world? He might very well see the world as Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, and Trump,
Mhm.
right? And he might see another possibility, which is Macron and China. You know, I don't know. Now, I mean, in terms of the Ukraine war, let's deal with that for a second. Which is that I
Okay.
think that Europe and the United States both want to pry China away from Russia.
Mhm.
And make China's support for Russia more and more of a liability to China.
Right. And I think that they would have a better chance of doing that together than one or the other.
Well, right. I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, so like Carney.
Mhm.
Speaking of like carnival show, Carney is visiting Trump today at the White House. As we were speaking, they're speaking. And Carney said, the era of inevitable integration of the United States and Canada is over. And I'm like, really? You really think so? No, obviously, this is rhetoric. Meaning, clearly, Europe wants to maintain, the Atlantic Alliance. And when they say, "Oh, we might have to go it alone without the United States," when people say that, like, I don't know, Trump represents like the United States changing, and that they can't count on the same relationship with the United States that they once had, that's rhetoric. Like structurally, in reality, no. Right. So Varoufakis, he's just he's still an anti-neoliberal. He wants to break with the Washington consensus as a Washington consensus. Right? Now, the thing is, China has developed under neoliberalism. China's not an alternative to neoliberalism. China is neoliberalism. And I think that Studebaker, in his book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, wrote very aptly, I thought, that clearly the world economy has to be reconfigured, but it can only happen if both the United States and China agree to it. And there doesn't seem to be a political will to do that on either side. My attitude was, of course, there's a political will to do that. It's Xi and Trump playing golf in Mar-a-Lago, right? Like, there absolutely is. And what he said this week in the Sublation show, I thought was very good, which is that, of course, China is open to this opportunity that Trump is presenting because they do have to make changes. But they also have to fight against entrenched interests that will resist and oppose that change. So that's true for Trump and it's true for Xi.
Right.
Right. But nonetheless, Xi might very well want the opportunity to act against the export-oriented producer capitalists in China who can no longer be supported in the same way because China can't continue in just the way it has.
Right.
Right? In the same way that the United States, Trump has to go against financial capitalism to some degree, right? Insofar as, as Bessent put it, moving from a consumption to a production economy and moving from Wall Street to Main Street. I mean,
Right.
by the way, I'll just say, if people want to know what's really going on, Besant.
Right.
Pay attention to Besant. Stephen Moran too, but Besant. And I've seen comments in our previous Cutronezone where people are like, I think Peter Kahn, I don't know who that is like, oh, no. And he has like some counter narrative of some journalism about like Peter Navarro and Howard Lutnick. It's like they are all on the same page. You know why? Because they're all subordinates of Trump. And that's that. Like, meaning all the stuff that we get in the media, from the Wall Street Journal to Clinton News Networks, CNN, or MSDNC, of course they're all against what Trump is doing, and so they're all going to pretend that it's a fiasco and there's no plan and idiots are in charge. And no, not at all. Right. And I think Scott Bessent is the one, and he's the person who's out there, the spokesperson. And he's not the fall guy the way Elon Musk was the fall guy for Doge. It's a little different.
Right.
Like, of course, everyone's a potential fall guy, but I think Bessent really is the person. And if you want to know what's going on, and by the way, earlier today, he was testifying in Congress. He's very consistent about what they're doing.
Right.
So again, the question is it possible? Hell if I know.
Right.
But they're going to try.
Yeah.
And it's going to have an effect. It's already having an effect. It's, in other words, it can't be undone. It's out. The horse is out the barn. It's gone. Do you know? Like, this has happened. It's not going to be undone. So,
well, I mean, the thing that Studebaker said that I think was worthwhile to remember about neoliberalism and about the Bretton Woods system was that it's not as though what happened was there was a perfect plan implemented that made everything work in the global order.
No, right.
No, it's
never like that.
They try things and they fail and then they adjust them, and it's like a mishmash of different approaches. There's a word I'm not being able to conjure at the moment, but we do not get a smoothly operating machine.
No,
it's always patched up together. Jury rigged. Thank you. It's a jury rigged, going to be a jury rigged system again, based on what we have now. But it will be enough of a difference to matter, to be worth marking. And so the question is, how well will it hold together? And I think for Marx, it's the biggest ideological hurdle to overcome is this idea of a terminal crisis of capitalism. This idea that basically it's a kind of vulgarized socialism or barbarism.
Yes. No, that was the Andrew Kleinman point. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And we have to overcome that and say,
no, capitalism is barbarism. Meaning, again, that ship has sailed. This has been barbarism for a while. Clearly, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, it's barbarism. Vietnam, what do we need? We need more.
The Iraq War.
Yeah, the war on terror, was major.
Yeah. No, I mean, it just continues on and on. The cartel in Mexico. I mean, it's barbarism, right?
Yes.
It's already barbarism now. It's not as though what we have now is harmony of some kind.
And the United States has been barbaric for a while.
Yeah.
Right. It's been
that's what Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan all represent is the U.S. barbarism, but also internally.
That's what I mean. Yeah, internally. Right. So, this is already dystopia. This is what I tell my academic students. Like, look, we're not waiting for the end of the world. We were just reading something by Adorno where he said the problem is that the world has outlived its downfall. And it really has. And you could say that that's been true at least since World War One.
Right.
At least since World War One. Because, again, the big wars of our time, Gaza, Ukraine, these are all legacies of World War One. Palestine is a World War One problem. Ukraine is a World War One problem. It all comes from that. And these are not settled at all.
Right. But when people read your essay in Sublation called Fear Itself, they're not going to keep that. There's a risk that they won't keep that reality in mind. And they'll read this as, well, Trump can do it.
Pollyanna.
Yeah, it's Pollyanna. Mm-hmm.
But, the left needs to hear that, and the right needs to hear that. That's why I was writing it for Compact, and I was like, these Compact people need to hear it. They need to hear that this is happening, and it's not going to be the end of the world. It might be a disaster in some way, but I really don't think that... so there was a moment, I didn't include this in the article, there was a moment where I watched the Atlantic editor, Jeffrey Goldberg, and he has like a PBS show. It's like a half-hour PBS show once a week. It's like Washington Weekly or something. And they were, and he had some like other criminals on there, some New York Times, some Wall Street Journal, some whatever people, journalists, right? And they literally were like, oh, well, of course we know that Trump is a Manchurian candidate, compromised by Putin. And so I was like, do they believe that? They might, or something. I don't know. Or they have to pretend to believe it? Like, what are we talking about? But then I just thought, okay, so then they can always fall back on that, which is that, like, he's the Manchurian candidate, Trump, who's deliberately bringing the U.S. down, and it's all like Putin's plan, and that this tariff thing is that. Right?
Right. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that people can deny the necessity for change, which is what they're doing when they say he's a Manchurian candidate. And what they're mostly denying is the crisis that's already here.
Right.
But you can always point to the crisis. It's so easy to say, well, wait a minute, let's take a look at the deficit. Let's take a look at from 2008 to now and what the COVID policies have done. Let's look at how close we were to nuclear war. All of these things, the crisis is every day it's here. So he's going to bring he's going to bring the United States down like Nixon did.
Right.
Like Nixon did.
Right.
Right.
Right. Or Reagan was going to do, remember the day after?
But no, like literally he is possibly going, if he were lucky, he's going to bring the United States down the way Nixon did and the way Reagan did. Exactly like that, right? Isn't that your point?
In other words, to create a new situation. Yeah, and that's what we have to, so it's a funny thing because I want certain ideas and certain conceptual frameworks to be available, but I also want to work on people psychologically at the level of, Dan Lazar complained about me and Trump and Platypus, right? And what he said was, oh, Chris Cutrone is just like telling us to just lie back and take it, right? And not fight back against Trump. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take that up, right? Which is, okay, you have to lay back in the dentist chair and get your teeth pulled. You can be terrified about it. You can try to delay it, or you can just go through it. And yes, you might die on the table, but
not from getting your teeth pulled. Mostly,
of course, you can.
Well, I know, but mostly not.
Yeah, mostly not. But bad things can happen. There can be, medical accidents have happened.
Right.
We know someone who went through that recently. Right. And so, for a minor operation. So, now. That's the question. The question is whether Trump's steps are necessary. And no one can say that they are because, maybe there are other ways of handling it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But no, he won the election. This is it. In other words, just deal with it. He won 2 elections, and this is what he always wanted to do. This is his final term in office. He's going to do it. And he's going to do it now because he can't count on the midterms going his way. Right?
And I have not heard any alternative except that basically comes down to I prefer this member of Trump's team and advisor over this member of Trump's team and this advisor. In other words, do it a little more with more nuance, a little more strategically, not.
But it's still a major step. I mean, in other words, it's no you can sugarcoat it. You can do it with better rhetoric. You can do it more competently or whatever. Did the tariff numbers make any sense? Like, fuck knows. Was it an AI generated chart? Was it like a mathematical error? It wasn't. Was it still crackpot? Maybe. But it doesn't even matter. It's a negotiating position.
Right.
And the 10% tariffs are the thing.
Right.
And that's already huge.
Mm-hmm.
That already entails a lot of structural change to the global economy. And so, but yes, I mean, we know that Kamala Harris would not have done tariffs. She might have been forced by inertia to keep the tariffs on that Biden had been forced to keep on from, on China, that Trump had initiated in his first term, but she wouldn't have done this. No
right.
way.
But okay, about the metaphor of laying back in the dentist chair and letting him pull your teeth. The point that Lazar is making is not that we are just that Chris is saying we need to have Trump treat the illness of capitalism so that capitalism can continue.
Right.
But rather he wants to say we could organize and overcome the necessity for our teeth to be pulled.
Lazar.
We could, Lazar wants to say we could overcome Trump. We could overcome what's making our body so unhealthy that we need to have our teeth pulled, right?
Sure. Too late for that, though.
Right? Yeah, we had 20 years there.
Yeah,
roughly, right?
Right.
Well, 17, let's say. 17, 18.
I've been at it for 20 years trying to get a socialist party started,
right.
basically.
Just about 20 years. Yeah, right. And we did not do it.
Has more history than I do trying to do that. His way didn't fail, and he's not willing to let me have my way.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's what it boils down to. Is like, come on, we've tried it this way. These sectarian left groups, these Trotskyist propaganda groups. Let's do something else. Right.
And the reason we should consider why that approach didn't work, I suppose. But yeah, obviously we need a different approach, and that's what you're calling Marxists to do. But for me, the most interesting thing is how, in this moment, the far left, a good portion of the far left, and Compact Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic, all agree.
Yeah,
they do. Fundamentally, tariffs are horrible. Trump is an idiot, not to be thought about, and I guess the task is to elect Democrats in the midterm, or to ignore the fact that the only option is to elect.
Yeah, and then to impeach Trump if the Democrats are elected. I mean, I don't think the Democrats have much hope of getting a Senate majority, but if things go badly enough, or if they can be shown, they can be seen to be having gone badly enough, then I guess hypothetically you could have the Democrats get a 60 vote, 66 vote. Like, how many do they need to impeach Trump? Right, because that's the thing that they're doing, is that they're laying all the framework for that with the Kilmar, Garcia case. They're trying to create a constitutional crisis and this kind of thing. But the point of the matter is that whatever Trump negotiates now via the tariffs will have to be ratified by Congress. I mentioned fentanyl earlier, right? American carnage. Remember Trump's first inaugural speech? American carnage, and people are like, holy shit, what the hell are we dealing with here, right? But it's true. And what's he referring to? He was referring to the opioid deaths and deaths of despair. And so the carnage is here. Unemployment is death. It is. And so it's not like it's gonna come, it's here. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? Trump is an idiot. He's not an idiot. Like, anyone who thinks that Trump is an idiot should try to take $100 million and turn it into $10 billion.
I'm willing to give it a shot.
Are you? Yeah. Right. Well, are you willing to be a slumlord or whatever? or
I'm willing to give it a shot and not succeed.
wine and dine rich people and finagle them out of all sorts of their money, to pay for over expensive condos.
Right, maybe I'm not willing to give it a shot, but
right,
it sounds good getting $100 million.
Right? No, I mean Trump is obviously not a complete idiot, and but also the people around him are clearly not idiots. Like Scott Bessent's not an idiot.
No, and also the people who say Trump's an idiot take themselves to be
way too seriously. Yeah,
right,
no. I mean, it's stupid. I mean, the thing is, like Marxism, like what are we doing? And I watched a video of Thomas Sowell.
Yeah.
And like an intellectual anti-intellectual. So he has like some book about like intellectuals. And he's like, intellectuals work on ideas and that's their folly, because you can never like discredit an idea. Whereas like an engineer, that was his other category, if they build a building that falls down, then you can say they were wrong. But with ideas, you can never definitively prove. Right. So it's some kind of like extreme Philistinism. And, but I was like, okay, so because Thomas Sowell is obviously not an engineer, he's an intellectual.
Right.
Right. And so the self-loathing of the intellectuals, and he's an ex-Marxist too.
Yeah.
Right. The self-loathing of the intellectuals, that's one problem. And we get all sorts of versions of that. We get Deleuze and Guattari, we get whatever bullshit. We get Althusser, strangling his wife. We get the self-hatred of the intellectuals, right? So let's not do that.
Right.
Let's take ideas seriously. And then what are the ideas? And what do they refer to? What's going on here? Meaning, what are we, you and I, Doug, talking about? Right? What we're talking about is really a kind of an impasse in terms of how people understand and even see capitalism. And I think that's really the issue, that I wanted to get back to maybe just for a second, which is the neoliberalism. Like, is there such a thing as neoliberalism? Isn't it just capitalism? And it's like, so how do we deal with forms of capitalism and continuity and change in capitalism, transformations in capitalism? Things do change, but some fundamentals remain the same. And also for me, what's the difference between like bourgeois society and capitalism? You don't have an accumulation crisis in bourgeois society, period. And therefore you don't have the necessity or the possibility of socialism, period. Right? So you don't have a proletariat. You don't have this particular crisis. And yet, it still is bourgeois society. We still have the same nominal values. And
how long did that society last?
Which, the capitalist society?
The bourgeois.
Oh, bourgeois society? Well, it grew for hundreds of years. Like, it grew from the Renaissance up into and flowered at the end of the 18th century. We have the Enlightenment. We have the American and French revolutions. We have, England was a little bit more advanced in this respect, so they had the Glorious Revolution.
But it was inside. It was within another society. It grew within
a feudal order, but a feudal order that was fundamentally changed, like absolutism. I think I mentioned that I was watching the Tudors, and it's all about the Catholics and the Protestants and Henry VIII and how he's just trying to amass power to himself, and he's making alliances with the bourgeoisie against the aristocrats. The birth of absolutism. And how the bourgeoisie is more revolutionary, and he has to beat them down, and then of course we get couple of centuries later, I guess we get a generation later, Elizabethan, like that's real absolutism, and then we get the English Civil War later, right? Which again was probably contingent, but nonetheless shows something. So it's a long process. You had the Protestant Reformation. You had millions of people die in Europe in the religious wars. You had like basically 100 years of war. So it grew within the feudal order, but it also really shattered the feudal order. And a long time before the American and French revolutions, which were, kind of the culmination, and in some ways less dramatic than the Protestant Reformation and things like that came earlier. So, bourgeois society was around.
Right. But I think like a capitalist or something, I think about or like a kind of like economistic Marxist. So when I think of bourgeois society, I want it to be totalizing, the way I view that capitalism is totalizing.
Well, it was totalizing as a freedom process, meaning it sort of permeated. It sort of dissolved. It was more of an organic development. Now, the challenge is that it's still an organic development. So I was thinking about this. I was thinking about like why these grand designs of capitalist politicians to change things never quite work out the way they intended. It's because this society still is bourgeois society, meaning it still is largely determined by what people are willing and unwilling to do at the level of work, migration of the working class, if people vote with their feet, consumption habits. I was just thinking about, the constitutional crisis that we're in potentially, right, where Trump is like, well, I don't know. Famously this week he said, I don't know, whether I'm going to defend the Constitution or not. I'll have to see what the lawyers have to say and what the Supreme Court has to say. But if we remember, Obama with Obamacare knew that it was unconstitutional, but he just wanted to set it into place. Like, clearly you can't mandate that people buy a private product, insurance. Obviously, it's unconstitutional. And everyone knew it at the time, but they still did it because they wanted to get this thing going, which now is there and can't be removed.
But
right?
Yeah, but we already were having to buy. But it was attached to if we wanted to do. I was thinking about car insurance. That's a little different. Anyway, this is a distraction.
Yeah, but health insurance, the idea that literally everyone, because they needed healthy people to pay for sick people.
Right.
So they needed young people who were opting out of buying health insurance to be forced to buy it.
You don't have to buy car insurance because you don't have to buy a car.
Right.
Right. But you do have to buy health insurance because you have a human body.
That's right. Right. And so, the thing is that they try these things, but ultimately, so one thing that they can't really do is mandate consumption. They can create circumstances that are, more or less compulsory, but they can't actually mandate it. And so this still is bourgeois society. So the whole neoliberal, like individual choice, consumer choice ideology had a kernel of truth, and that will remain. And it was always the case, right? It's not like the Fordist state removed consumer choice from people. It didn't.
No.
Right? And I think that we're in a realm, when we talk about civil society and campaign for a socialist party, we're in a realm of consumer politics, we might say. Meaning most issues, most like political issues are really consumer issues. Meaning police brutality is a consumer issue. Meaning, can you return this product? If you're unsatisfied with it, the police. You're a taxpayer.
Right.
And so do you have any say over this product that you've paid for? Right? I mean, so a lot of issues are like that. And Marxism seems completely from left field because it's supposed to not just be consumer issues, but producer issues. But what the hell are producer issues? Is it like unions deciding to go on strike because they don't want their company to do business with Israel? Well, guess what? That's a consumer issue. That's not a producer issue. That's also a consumer issue. Everything is a consumer issue now. Students don't want their tuition to go to whatever, an Israeli academic coming to speak at their campus, right? Or they don't want to pay tuition to buy a degree in which there are investors in Israel on the board of trustees because they just don't like that association.
But you organize with other workers to insist that that your rate of pay will always be above a certain point.
Yeah, that would be more of a producer issue. That would be a collective bargaining issue. But of course, the struggle for socialism isn't really about that.
No.
Right? At the end of the day, it's not really about that. And so, again, I think that what gets left out and what's really roaring back now that people don't want to deal with and that frightens them is politics, meaning like real politics. And, you know, it's like buyer's remorse. We were talking about that, like Trump, buyer's remorse. The anecdote that I'll give is my mother voted for Trump, and now she regrets it. Why? Because of the tariffs. Why? Because it's hurting her stock investments, such as they are. She's a retiree. You know, she's on a fixed income, and she's also concerned about the legacy that she's leaving her children and grandchildren. And so she hates the fact that Trump is threatening the stock market.
But the stock market's gone back up.
It's completely recovered. So, you know, we'll continue to go up. So, you know, that was just, you know, like we've all been forced to buy into the stock market, which is horrible. That's also a neoliberal thing. I mean, much more so. I guess working class people already had like stocks and bonds, actually. My grandparents, who were all unionized factory workers, all had stocks and bonds ultimately as part of their legacy. But, you know, so the privatization, you know, again, Wall Street. And the big question back in the Great Recession was, how do we get all this Wall Street money to invest in actual production so that it can provide jobs? You know, I always like to point out, Hillary was asked, I think on 60 Minutes, she was asked, what's the one thing that keeps you up at night? And I think that people expected her to say, oh, Vladimir Putin, Russia, world peace. No, she said, how to adopt policies that ensure that capital produces jobs for people. And I was like, okay, Comrade Clinton. Like, that's basically the concern of a Soviet bureaucrat. You know, that is going to be a concern in the dictatorship of the proletariat. You know, that is a concern for the Chinese Communist Party. You know, this is Marxism. Guess what? It's capitalism, right? Capitalist politicians only care about this. At the end of the day, they only really care about that. And that's what Trump is attacking. That's what he's trying to deal with now. You know, that's what he's trying to address.
But you said just a moment ago, what people are afraid of is politics. And when I was at the Platypus Convention, I was asked if I thought politics or the political character of society was going to continue after a socialist revolution, or if it was inevitably just part of the human condition. And I said, no, politics won't continue, that we won't have the necessity for this might makes right approach to society, but we will develop forms of freedom. And I gave kind of
alleviate the need for force.
Yeah, I said, and you know, in the future, the vision of a socialist, that you know, every common person will be as smarter than Einstein, you know, as creative as Picasso, as sexually satisfied and dynamic as Madonna. This is the stupidest thing ever. And that was my answer. And I just thought it was a very kind of pat, doctrinaire kind of answer.
But you know, it's still worth them considering, meaning, you know, I think that we've talked about this before, but I would just emphasize, I think that I was also talking about this with recently with Dave McCarricker and Ben Studebaker about politics, and how from a Marxist perspective, the only real politics is the class struggle. Meaning this stuff among the capitalists is not really politics. It's what the Frankfurt School people called rackets. It's gang warfare. And, you know, I guess gangs have to, you know, serve their constituency to some degree, and they have to mobilize their constituencies against the other gangs. But really, from a Marxist perspective, and again, it's very quaint, it's very 1840s, it's very Marx and Engels as young men, you know, that they're just thinking, okay, what is the political question of our time? It's the class struggle, it's the social question, it's the proletariat. And that's the only thing that we have that is even remotely political, meaning that is what is deciding the destiny of society. Right? But guess what? We haven't been doing that for a long time. You know, we haven't been doing that since the failure of Marxism, which happened a long time ago. We haven't been doing that. We've been doing gangsterism. And some gangsters have been under the flag of the working class, but they've still been gangsters. They haven't been politically socialist people. you know.
So when you say we're afraid of politics, do you mean we're afraid of class struggle, or do you mean we're afraid of what politics is under capitalism?
We're afraid of the gangsterism, and which we are, and which we are rightly so. Meaning, obviously, the political task is to abolish politics, and that we do need political freedom to be able to do that. And that is not something that happens instantaneously. The class struggle doesn't end, but according to Marx, only begins with the dictatorship of the proletariat. How's that? He actually wrote that. He said the class struggle only begins with the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning everything before that is just preparatory. Right? So, a socialist party is going to be a gang amongst other gangs. It's going to be seen as such. I can tell you that. That's what the SPD, that's what the Socialist Party. I like to point out, Socialist Party candidates in the United States were disqualified from elections because they were said to not be really a political party, but rather a membership organization, meaning a racket. That's what we will be faced with. We'll be faced with that. In other words, socialists will never be accepted as part of political society, because political society is just the gangs negotiating with each other, the capitalists. And the socialists will always be seen as outside of that.
Right.
And so the goal of an end of politics is not a goal of an end to, I don't know, I think of Ben Studebaker would object, because he would say, well, isn't humanity still going to be talking about what the good is in socialism? Sure, but that's not politics, because that doesn't have to involve what we think of as politics, which is force. Which is force, the state as force, right? It's not a debating society,
right?
You don't need a state to debate things. You don't. And we already in bourgeois society know that we don't need the state to determine the course of history, because bourgeois society developed more or less parallel to, underneath, aside from the state. And it still does. And the politicians react to it. Now, so we have to struggle for power in order to do away with the need for power.
Right.
And I mean, I am just, really trying to clear the air so that we can start to think about, even begin to think about, what it means to organize for that kind of power. The kind of power that is about the abolition of the need for power.
It's very kind of difficult, and it does make me realize why it is that the campaign for a socialist party is so frustrating sometimes just to think about. Because when we have these after party conversations, often enough we get caught up in, okay, well, how do we develop the right theory? What is the right theory? How should we understand this moment? Right. And then against that is no, what we need to do is be active in civil society and just do some good work. And then people who just a moment earlier would have been railing against the verbal diarrhea of the intellectuals in our midst will turn right around and say, oh, we can't just organize activism, that won't get us to socialism. We have to have socialism. We have to do it as socialists. And I'm like, okay, but now we're back to the problem of dealing with the intellectuals.
Dealing with this idea, the idea of socialism, how to properly understand it, apprehend it. And obviously the main issue that we have is that socialism is equated with statism. It's equated with the welfare state. And the neoliberals are there, to say the only alternative to this, what we have now, is fascism. And you could call it socialism. You could call it national socialism. You could call it some other kind of socialism. But it's basically fascism. And it is about violence. It's not about freedom. And then the left is stupid enough to say, that's right, it's not about freedom, it's about equality. And yes, we are going to send people to the gulag. right? Because that's been going on for a while. You know, like the
Yeah.
one Bernie guy who was like, yes, the Republicans will have to be sent to the gulag.
Right.
Back in 2016, you know, during the primaries. And, you know, a naive kid, whatever, he can only imagine his parents being forced to change their mind under a
Right.
gulag type condition, because that's what we're talking about. And, you know, again, for us, I think what's frustrating for people is that they want to affect things now.
Yeah.
They want to affect things now. And I feel like, well, no, that's not available. So what can we affect? We can affect ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something.
Yeah. When you tell Dan Lazar to lay back and get his teeth pulled, what you're telling him is, you know, the other option than that is to try to continue on with the Democrats and avoid
the rotten tooth
and just let the tooth rot in your head. You don't have the option of not having rotten teeth in this right now.
No.
And maybe if you shape up and brush every day and floss, and then maybe you won't have to go through this again. That's what you're saying.
Right. But basically, I mean, look, right now, I think that in the article I say we've kicked the can down the road as far as it could go, meaning they've tried.
Right.
And also, you know, you could see that what Trump is doing as a kind of kicking the can down the road. As Marxists, we would see it that way. But more immediately, it is taking an action. It is doing something, as opposed to.
Well, this is what I was addressing by bringing up the terminal crisis idea and the variations of it, which is that there is a way in which we don't literally kick the can down the road through financialization, which is what generally is really meant by kicking the can down the road. We'll just inflate the debt, we'll financialize more, and then someone will have to pay for it later. That's kicking the can down the road.
Well, Keynes also had an idea about this.
Yeah.
You know, which is to try to address the problem of underconsumption.
Right.
Which would be a recurrent problem. He didn't think that you solved it forever. So that's also kicking the can down the road.
Right, but from the Marxist but there's a theory of crisis which says that you have to have a massive devaluation, which can be very violent, in order to recover. You can't recover through, you know, state spending or propping up these industries or financializing properly and then getting everything back into balance. All you're doing is setting up the terms.
I mean, what's interesting is that state spending is inflationary and therefore is devaluing.
That's true.
You know? I mean, that's what, I mean, again, what are the takeaways?
Right, but that argues for this idea that you're going to have to face a crisis, because a certain level of inflation sets off a massive economic crisis, which is devaluing not just
whether you can do it in a controlled way or not, right? And I think that
there's control
Nixon,
and there's control.
Yeah, Nixon and the Plaza Accords, Reagan, and now Trump is actually trying to do it in a controlled way.
Right. And I guess what the Marxists would say is eventually we're going to have to see something like World War II again to really do the deal, to get the boom that came after World War II.
It's a funny way of thinking about things, because it's a funny way of living in the past and living in the present, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning before the Great Depression and World War II, would any Marxists have thought so? No. So it's only after World War II. So that means that we've naturalized something that Marxism has nothing to say about, and we've somehow said that Marxism proves this to be the case. And it's like, no. Like, in other words, like World War I and World War II were not necessary.
Right. Not just like we could have had socialism, but even within the context
of
capitalism.
Within capitalism. Mm-hmm. Meaning, you know, Hitler was not necessary.
Right.
You know? I mean, look, Stalin forced collectivization of the Soviet Union was not necessary. The only thing that Stalinists will ever tell you is, well, it was necessary in order to be able to fight Hitler. But it's like, but Hitler wasn't necessary. Like none of this was necessary. So we have to be careful about that. And that's also what people do with Lenin's theory of imperialism, is that they're like, oh, well, World War I proved Lenin's theory of imperialism. And it's like, no. First of all, it's not unique to Lenin. It predates Lenin. It's Kautsky. And World War I was not necessary according to this view.
Right.
Now, so again, they just completely mistake what the issue is. And I think that this is how Marxism has been turned into an ideology. It's just like this, that it's been turned into an ideology. That it went from a prognosis on capitalism to being an ideology that explains all prior history as somehow having been necessary, and therefore anticipates more of the same in the future as necessary.
But for the revolution.
But for the revolution, but who believes in the revolution, Doug? I mean, this is the thing. Like, I knew the Marxist humanists. I had conversations with them. I knew them over a significant amount of time. I knew other people like Adolf Reed, Moshe Postone, the Spartacist League. Like, I have encountered leftists. I can tell you, none of them believed in the revolution. None. Right. One of the only reasons why I'm the last Marxist is I still believe in it. But not like a millenarian kind of whatever. No, I just think there's going to be
not in the way that it's impossible to believe in it.
Right.
That's one of the problems with the reason they didn't believe in it is because their conception of it made it impossible to believe in.
Yeah, it became something like, and it's like, no, the thing is, again, thinking about Marx and Engels, or even Lenin, like 1848 happened, Paris Commune happened, 1905 Russian Revolution happened. So my view is there's going to be a revolution. The only question is what results from it, because what's going to become of it? What's going to become of it? Because my view is that up till now, the revolution has just given us more capitalism. So that's why we're not like, believers in this end of days kind of like salvation. It's just, well, it is going to happen, and it's going to happen more or less. Meaning, in a place like the United States, this is the revolution, Trump. And our generation and the millennials should have built a socialist party so that when this revolution happened, it wouldn't be this revolution.
Right.
And we have to start working now so that the next revolution won't be this again.
Yeah, and that will be, if history is our guide, somewhere between 30 to 50 years from now.
Yeah, I know. It's hell, but sorry. Sorry,
no,
that's true.
You said something, I think, in your recent lecture on Adorno's essays, which was towards the end when you're just sort of talking off the cuff. I'm not sure if it was that one, but you said to a student that, it used to be the case that people thought that as you got older, you changed qualitatively, you became mature, and you aged into a different kind of person with a different role in society. But now we just get old and wear out.
Yeah, we just get old, right?
We just get old, wear out, and that really hit me, especially as I started thinking about the neoliberalism ending and what I'd been a part of, and how I'd conceived of it at the time, and how I was now facing the need to reconceive of it and try to do better, and how little time I really had to participate in that in any meaningful way.
We had very little time. We have very little time.
I thought I had forever when I was 20, right?
Sure.
And now I look ahead and I think, I've been wasting time in a way for the last 17 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For 20 years. Yep.
Yeah. But
no, I mean, it's, and what we can say, we can admire about Trump.
He's 80 years old and he's
doing it. And also he set himself this task. He kind of toyed with the idea starting 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But then, 10 years ago, he got serious about it. He thought, like Bernie, they both came up with the idea of 2016 and 2012.
Mm-hmm.
They both came up with this at that time. And, he's done it. He sees the opportunity. And we have to pay attention to what that means. What it means for someone who has a very 80s view of things to be the man in the moment, to bring what's necessary now. Because that's really, like, the only Marxism in my article is that, about the temporal rhythm, the historical rhythm of transformations in capitalism, and this curious thing where ideas are formulated 40 years ahead of time, but then they're like catching up with the past when they're implemented. And then, it's building on an article that I wrote on Milton Friedman that was also for Compact, but I had to pull it because of the editing was a fiasco, about like how Friedman's ideas weren't really implemented. And so now Trump is not like an economist theorist. Like, he has the advantage of, he has some ideas, but he doesn't really have any grand idea. Right? So in some ways, he only wants to, from our perspective, salvage neoliberalism. But as it turns out, the only way to salvage neoliberalism is to fundamentally change it.
Right.
In the same way that we could say that neoliberalism didn't want to overthrow Fordism, but salvage it.
Right.
Right. And, that's, again, just keeping that basic idea in mind about like how changes happen in capitalism, because what we have to think about is what made Trump possible. And what the Democrats and the left will tell you is that it's racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, that's the condition of possibility for Trump. And it's like, that is not the condition of possibility for Trump. The condition of possibility for Trump is for a Reaganite era person to have a critique of Reaganism, that it was failing to fulfill its own promise.
Right. Yeah.
And then come in and make those reforms at the end of Reaganism. It's a total paradox. And yet, dialectically, Hegel talks about this kind of thing, right? That it's the people who are fighting to uphold something that abolish it.
Right.
And the people who are fighting to abolish it who uphold it.
Right. Well, listen, I think this is a good point to shift gears and go over into the Parrot Room, the Patreon. Over there, I want to talk about postmodernism and neoliberalism.
Great.
I have some ideas of my own. We can flip those by you. But
Your
also,
manifesto.
The manifesto is part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which you liked. You
yeah.
That.
Yeah.
And also, maybe we can raise the something I brought up to Wyatt, which is smartism.
Yeah. Let's talk about your Wyatt conversation. That was good.
Yeah. All right. So I'll see you in just a minute, and everyone should go over and join us in the Parrot Room. And then after that, there'll even be an after party conversation. So I'll see you on the other side. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.